Clara Jane Abernathy had spent her whole life being measured by the way she walked, until one newspaper clipping sent her across Texas to a stranger's ranch. But what began as a practical marriage soon uncovered hidden motives, old wounds, and a love neither Clara nor Wyatt knew how to trust. This story reminds us that real love does not ask you to become perfect. It changes the world around you so you can stand tall as you are. If it touches your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe.
Sunday mornings in Texas were made for two things: praying to God and judging your neighbors. Clara Jane Abernathy sat on the edge of a wooden bench in the church courtyard, summer of 1878. The heat was already rising from the Brazos County dirt, thick and heavy. She wore her best dress, a faded white cotton thing. She had spent 3 hours ironing it, making sure the hem fell just right, just low enough to brush the tops of her boots. The left boot had a sole an inch and a half thicker than the right, a gift from a childhood bout of scarlet fever, a constant, heavy reminder. Today was her third time sitting on this bench, waiting. Bracing herself, she smoothed her skirt. Her hands were perfectly steady. That was the trick to surviving pity, Clara had learned. You never let them see your hands shake. 2 men had already come and gone this year. The first was Caleb Miller, back in April. He had come to the cabin, eaten her stew, and watched her walk across the kitchen to fetch the coffee. He had stopped chewing, stared at the heavy, uneven dip of her shoulders. He didn't even have the courage to tell her to her face. He sent a message through her father the next day. "She cooks fine, Silas, but I need a whole woman to work my fields. A crippled wife is a burden a poor man can't carry." Clara hadn't cried when she heard that. She had simply turned back to the dough on the table, kneading it until her knuckles ached. She didn't have to speak. Her silence said everything. "I am not broken. I am just built for a harder road." The second was Hiram Brooks, May. Hiram was a gentleman. He came to the porch, drank her tea, talked about the weather and the cattle markets. But when the tea was gone, he set his porcelain cup down with a sharp, terrifying click. He looked Clara right in the eye. "You are a brilliant girl, Clara," Hiram had said, his voice dripping with reasonable, polite cruelty. "You read books. You have a sharp mind, but a man in my position has a reputation to uphold. I require a wife who can walk by my side, someone who won't make me lower my head in shame before a crowd." Shame. The word had echoed in Clara's head for weeks. It was the clearest lesson she had ever received on how the world worked. Explicit. A woman's intellect, her kindness, her quiet strength, none of it weighed an ounce on the scales of society if the package it came in wasn't perfect. To them, she wasn't a person. She was a reflection of the man she stood next to, and a limping reflection was bad for business now. It was June, and Elias Vance was walking across the courtyard toward her. Elias was the town's golden boy. Wealthy, incredibly handsome. He had smiled at her after service, asked her to wait by the oak tree so they could discuss the future. Clara's heart did a foolish, traitorous flutter against her ribs. She told it to stop. Elias reached her. He took off his hat. "Miss Clara." "You look lovely this morning, thank you, Elias," she said evenly. She didn't stand up. Standing up would break the illusion. He opened his mouth to speak again, but a shadow fell over them both. Martha Vance, Elias's mother. The older woman didn't say a word to Clara, not a greeting, not a polite nod. She just stopped, her silk skirts rustling, and let her gaze drop slowly to the hem of Clara's dress, to the thick-soled boot. The look on Martha's face wasn't anger. It was worse. It was the look you give a stray dog that has wandered onto your clean porch. Martha turned to her son. "Elias, the carriage is waiting. We have guests arriving for lunch. You will not be late." Elias looked at his mother, then down at Clara. The golden boy crumbled. "Right there in the dust. I have to go," Elias stammered. His voice was suddenly loud, too loud, drawing the eyes of the lingering congregation. "I'm sorry, Miss Abernathy. I thought about it. But my mother is right. We just aren't a match. It wouldn't look right." He backed away. He put his hat on and practically ran to his mother's side. Silence fell over the courtyard. Every eye in town was on the girl in the faded white dress. Clara felt the heat creeping up her neck, but she remembered her own rule. Don't let them see you shake. She stood up, slowly, deliberately. She let her weight settle on her shorter leg. She didn't hide the limp. She didn't hunch her shoulders. She lifted her chin, looked straight through the crowd of staring faces, and walked away. One heavy step, one light step. She walked out of the churchyard with the slow, terrifying pride of a queen who had just been exiled. That night the Abernathy cabin was dead quiet. Silas Abernathy sat at the kitchen table. The oil lamp threw long shadows against the log walls. He was a good man. Silas, but life had beaten the fight out of him long ago. Clara was in the other room, reading by candlelight. She hadn't spoken a word about church. Silas looked down at the week's-old Galveston Daily News spread across the table. His calloused, trembling finger traced a small square of ink in the back pages. Rancher 25, Brazos County, seeks a wife of good character and willing hands. No prior acquaintance necessary. Write to W. Sterling, Postbox 14. No prior acquaintance, no meeting, no looking at a girl and measuring her worth by the symmetry of her stride. Silas picked up his hunting knife. He pressed the blade to the newspaper. Snip, 14-year-old Toby walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. He saw the clipping in his father's hand. "Pa," Toby whispered. "What's that?" Silas looked at his son. His eyes were red, shining with a desperate, heartbroken kind of anger. "It's a way out, Toby," Silas said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "A man who ain't met her can't judge her. I won't have her paraded around like damaged goods anymore. A person's value isn't built from the ground up, it's built from the inside out." Silas folded the clipping carefully. "If this town can't see the gold in her," he whispered to the empty room, "I'll send her to a stranger in the dark. Maybe he'll have the sense to feel it." The newspaper clipping sat on the scarred pine of the kitchen table. Clara found it the next morning, beside the flour tin, placed there she knew with heavy intention. She picked it up. The paper was cheap, thin, and smelled of stale ink. She read the words. Then she read them again. "Rancher 25, Brazos County, seeks a wife." She set it down. Her hands flattened against the table. The wood was cool against her palms. A mail-order bride. The idea tasted like ash in her mouth. It felt like defeat, like admitting the gossips in town were right, that she was unlovable in the regular way. So she had to be shipped off like a catalog plow. But then Clara looked at the words again. No prior acquaintance necessary. She stared at that line. It was a cold transaction, stripped of romance. But beneath the coldness there was a strange, sharp sliver of equality. Ink didn't have a limp. Paper didn't walk with an uneven gait. A man reading a letter couldn't stare at her boots and feel embarrassed. It was brutal, but it was fair. Her father walked into the kitchen. He had his hat in his hands. Silas looked older today. The rejection in the churchyard had aged him a decade. "I already wrote to him, Clara," Silas said. His voice was a rasp last night. "Left the letter with the postmaster at dawn." Clara turned. She didn't yell. "You wrote to a stranger. To offer me up." "I wrote to a man who might have the sense to see past the dirt on the surface," Silas corrected. He stepped closer. "But I didn't lie to him, Clara. I couldn't do that to you. I wouldn't set you up for another fool to turn you away at the door." He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a piece of scratch paper, a copy of what he had sent. He handed it to her. He wasn't hiding behind his authority. He was laying his choices bare before her. Clara read her father's messy scrawl. "Mr. Sterling, my daughter is Clara, 18 years old. She is smart. She works harder than any man I know. But I will tell you this plain. She had the fever as a child. She walks with a heavy limp. I tell you this because I will not send her across Texas just to be looked at with pity and sent back. If you want a perfect doll, do not reply." Clara's breath hitched. Her father had laid her greatest shame out on paper, blunt, bleeding. But reading it, Clara didn't feel exposed. She felt protected. Her father had built a wall around her pride, daring the world to try and breach it. "If you don't write back," Silas said, his voice cracking, "then we stay here, and to hell with this town." But the rancher did write back. The reply came 2 weeks later, a thick envelope, heavy parchment. Silas handed it to Clara unopened. It was her life. It was her letter. She broke the wax seal. The handwriting inside was dark, slanting, and utterly devoid of flourish. "Mr. Abernathy, I appreciate a man who doesn't deal in lies. My ranch needs a manager. Someone to run the house and keep the ledgers. I am not looking for a parlor ornament. I am looking for a partner in the work. If your daughter is willing, she may come to Brazos County. We will see if the fit is right." It was signed, simply, Wyatt Sterling. Clara read it aloud to the empty kitchen. He hadn't offered sweet words. He hadn't promised she was beautiful despite her leg. He hadn't offered pity. He offered work. He offered a trial. "I am not looking for a parlor ornament." For the first time in years, Clara felt a spark light in her chest. A man who measured worth by what hands could do, not how legs could walk. She packed her things that afternoon. She didn't own much. 2 dresses, a sturdy pair of working boots, her mother's worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. Then she packed the most important thing, a heavy wooden box. Inside were glass vials, dried bundles of yarrow, willow bark, and comfrey. Her mother had taught her how to heal. Clara packed the box with fierce, meticulous care. She was bringing her mind, her skills, her value. She wasn't just bringing a broken body. She was buckling the leather straps when Toby walked into her small room. Her 14-year-old brother stood in the doorway. He looked skinny, all knees and elbows, but his eyes were ancient. "You're really going," Toby said. "I am." Toby walked up to the bed. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a stone. It was smooth gray river rock, worn down by time and water until it looked exactly like a heart. He pressed it into Clara's palm. "I found it by the creek," Toby muttered, looking at his boots. "Figured you could keep it in your apron, so you don't forget where you come from." Clara's throat tightened. She closed her fingers around the stone. It was warm from his pocket. Toby looked up. He met his sister's eyes, and the boy spoke with the weight of a grown man. "Clara, listen to me," Toby said. The words were slow, deliberate. "You are taking that stagecoach because you choose to. But if you get there, and that man is mean, or if he looks at you like Elias Vance looked at you, you turn right around, you hear me?" Clara blinked, surprised by the fierce fire in her little brother. "You don't owe him nothing just because he bought a ticket," Toby continued, his jaw set tight. "And you don't owe Pa nothing. Your life belongs to you. Nobody has the right to make you feel small. Not ever again." Clara pulled her brother into a tight, desperate hug. She buried her face in his shoulder, a 14-year-old boy, raised in the dirt of Texas, teaching her the lesson the whole town of adults had failed to learn. Consent wasn't just about the body. It was about the soul. "I hear you, Toby," she whispered. "I won't let anyone make me small." The next morning, the stagecoach was waiting. The air was thick with summer dust. Silas stood by the wheels. He didn't say much. Western men rarely did when their hearts were breaking. He just tipped his hat, kissed her forehead, and handed her up into the carriage. Clara took a seat by the window. The driver cracked the whip. The horses surged forward. The heavy wooden wheels groaned, kicking up a cloud of red dirt. Clara looked out the window. The town of Clover Creek faded into the haze. The church steeple, the general store, the people who had measured her and found her lacking. She sat back against the worn leather seat. She slipped her hand into her pocket. Her fingers traced the smooth edges of the stone heart. She didn't know Wyatt Sterling. She didn't know if he was kind or cruel or just as cold as his letter. But as the stagecoach rolled toward Brazos County, Clara felt something strange settle over her. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was freedom, the terrifying, beautiful freedom of a blank slate. The Millhaven depot was nothing more than a wooden platform baking in the afternoon sun. The stagecoach lurched to a halt. The dust settled like a heavy, stifling blanket over everything. Clara sat in the carriage for a long moment, listening to the ringing in her ears from 3 days of travel. She took a breath. She smoothed her skirt. She opened the door and stepped out onto the platform. Her left boot hit the boards first, the familiar, heavy drop of her hip. She steadied herself. She looked up. A man was standing near the hitching post. He was leaning against a wooden beam, a dark Stetson pulled low over his eyes. He was tall, broader than the men back home. His shirt was a faded blue, rolled up at the forearms, revealing skin burned dark by the Texas sun. He had a strong, square jaw covered in a few days of dark stubble. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like the land itself, weathered, hard, unforgiving. He straightened up. He walked toward her. Clara stood perfectly still. This was the moment the letter became flesh, the moment he would see her walk, see the uneven tilt of her shoulders, and the truth would register. Wyatt Sterling stopped 2 feet away. His eyes were a dark, earthy brown. They flicked down to her boots. Once, a simple gathering of facts. Then he looked right back up into her eyes. He didn't flinch. He didn't frown, and most importantly, his eyes didn't soften with that sickening, watery glow of pity. "Miss Abernathy," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Mr. Sterling," Clara replied. Her voice didn't shake. He didn't bow. He didn't offer a flowery greeting. Wyatt reached out his right hand. He didn't offer it palm up, like she was a fragile lady stepping over a puddle. He offered it straight on, firm, like he was greeting a new ranch hand, like he was greeting an equal, the deepest kind of respect. Clara took it. His grip was rough with calluses, strong and sure. "I have a bag," she said, "and a box." Wyatt nodded. He didn't say, "Let me get that for you, you poor thing." He just walked to the back of the coach, hoisted her heavy trunk onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing, grabbed her wooden box, and headed for a sturdy-looking wagon. Clara followed. She walked behind him. One heavy step, one light step. The wood of the platform thudded beneath her boots. Wyatt didn't slow his pace to an insulting crawl. But Clara noticed something. He didn't walk so fast that she had to scramble to keep up either. He just walked a steady, even rhythm. A rhythm she could match. They climbed into the wagon. The ride out of Millhaven took 40 minutes. The landscape was vast. Oceans of yellow grass stretching out to touch a massive cloudless sky. They didn't talk much. Wyatt wasn't a man to fill quiet air with useless noise. Halfway there, he looked over at her box. "Your father said you work hard. What's in the box?" Wyatt asked. "Medicine," Clara said. "Herbs, poultices. My mother taught me. I can set a bone if I have to. I can stitch a tear." Wyatt kept his eyes on the road. "You ever stitch a horse?" "No," Clara answered honestly. "But flesh is flesh. I can figure it out." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Good. The vet in Millhaven charges too much. You can take over the stables." Clara blinked. He wasn't making her a maid. He was giving her a trade. Giving her authority. The wagon credited a small rise. Below them sat the Sterling Ranch. It wasn't a mansion, it was practical. A large, two-story house made of thick timber. A massive barn. Miles of sturdy fencing holding back a sea of grazing cattle. It looked like a place built on sweat and stubbornness. Wyatt pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. A man stepped out of the barn. He was older, maybe near 60. He wore a faded gray jacket, Confederate issue, long stripped of its brass. As the man walked toward them, Clara saw it. The heavy, dragging step of his left leg, a war wound, a permanent, bone-deep limp. This was Amos Thorne, the foreman. Wyatt helped Clara down from the wagon. Amos stopped a few feet away. The older man looked at Clara. Clara looked at Amos. Neither of them said a word about it. They didn't have to. Amos tipped his hat. Clara gave a small, respectful nod. It was the silent brotherhood of the broken. In that single glance, they both said, "I know the pain of the cold mornings. I know the stairs. You are safe here." A woman banged a wooden spoon against a metal pot on the porch. "If you're done staring at the dirt, the food is getting cold." The woman was Maeve, 45, with fiery red hair streaked with gray, flour on her apron, and eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She was an Irish immigrant, in Texas in 1878. Being Irish meant you were often treated just one step above the livestock. Clara walked up the steps. Maeve didn't move out of the way. She stood her ground, looking Clara up and down. "I'm Maeve," she barked. "I cook. I don't clean your boots. I don't mend your dresses. And I don't suffer fools. I'm Clara. I can clean my own boots. I can mend my own dresses. And I prefer my meals hot." Maeve stared. Then a loud, barking laugh erupted from the cook's chest. "She has got a spine, Wyatt," Maeve called out. She turned to Clara, her voice dropping a fraction, the edge softening into a fierce solidarity. "You listen to me, girl. They look right through me in town because of how I talk and where I come from. They look at you and only see what you can't do. We don't play that game in this house. In this kitchen you are seen, completely." "You understand, I understand," Clara said softly. Dinner was served at a long scarred wooden table. There was no fine china, no polite, suffocating rules of etiquette. Wyatt sat at the head, Amos to his right, Maeve and Clara to his left. They ate roasted beef and potatoes. Amos told a story about a stubborn calf. Maeve complained about the price of salt. Wyatt listened, eating quietly. It was a family of outcasts, a house of strays. When the plates were clear, Wyatt poured a cup of black coffee. He looked at Clara. The room went quiet. "I don't play games, Clara," Wyatt said. His voice was level, businesslike, but not unkind. "You saw the ranch. You met the people. You see how we live." He set his mug down. "I am giving you 1 week. You stay here in the guest room. You work the garden. You look at the ledgers. You see if this is a life you can stomach." He leaned forward slightly. "Next Friday morning, I will ask you a question. If the answer is yes, we ride into Millhaven and we sign the marriage papers at the courthouse. We become a team." He paused. "If the answer is no, I will buy you a stagecoach ticket back to Clover Creek, or anywhere else you want to go, and I will shake your hand and wish you well. The choice is yours, completely yours." Clara sat frozen. Her whole life, choices had been made for her. Caleb Miller chose to leave. Hiram Brooks chose his reputation. Elias chose his mother. Her father chose the newspaper ad. Wyatt Sterling was taking the pen out of his own hand and handing it to her. He was giving her the one thing she had never possessed. Agency, Clara said, her voice steady. 1 week, Wyatt agreed, that night. Clara lay in the small bedroom at the back of the house. The window was open. The Texas wind howled softly through the prairie grass. She held Toby's stone in her hand. She thought about the way Wyatt had shaken her hand, the way Amos had nodded, the way Maeve had demanded she take up space. She didn't know if this was a love story. She didn't even know if she liked Wyatt Sterling yet. He was hard and closed off and carried shadows in his eyes. But as she closed her eyes, Clara realized something profound for the first time in 11 years. Her leg didn't ache from the weight of other people's stares. In the dark of the Sterling ranch, she wasn't a burden. She was just Clara. and that was enough. Monday tasted like dust and strong coffee. Clara woke before the sun. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. She tied her apron, stepped out of her small room, and went to work. She didn't ask what to do. She just looked around and saw what needed doing. The pantry was a mess, sacks of flour piled haphazardly, dried beans spilling from a split burlap seam. She spent the morning hauling, sweeping, and stacking. Her bad leg ached, a dull rhythmic throb. She ignored it. By noon, she had claimed a corner of the tack room in the barn. She unpacked her wooden box. Glass vials caught the dusty light. Dried yarrow, willow bark, comfrey root. A ranch hand named Miller came in around 2 o'clock. He was leading a roan mare. The horse was wild-eyed, blowing hard. A nasty gash torn across its left flank from barbed wire. Miller looked frantic. "Boss is out on the South Ridge. Need to ride into town for the vet." Clara stepped out of the tack room. "Bring her into the stall. Tie her tight." Miller blinked. He looked at Clara's leg, then at her face. "Miss, that's a deep tear. She's skittish. I said bring her in." Clara's voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It was a flat, immovable line. Miller brought the horse in. Clara washed her hands in the water trough. She grabbed a needle, heavy thread, and a bottle of clear alcohol. She walked up to the mare. The horse sidestepped, snorting. Clara didn't flinch. She placed a firm hand on the animal's neck. "Easy, girl," she murmured. A low, steady vibration. "I know it burns. I know." She poured the alcohol. The horse shrieked and bucked. Clara held her ground, leaning her weight into the mare's shoulder. Then she began to stitch. Her hands were fast. Sure, unafraid of the blood. She didn't know it. But Wyatt Sterling had ridden back. He stood in the wide double doors of the barn. He didn't announce himself. He didn't rush forward to take the needle from her hand. He didn't tell her it was a man's job. He just watched. He saw a woman covered in horse blood and stable dirt, and he saw competence. He saw a partner. He waited until she tied the final knot, wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, and patted the horse neck. Only then did Wyatt step forward. "Clean work," he said. Clara turned. She hadn't heard him. "She needs to rest for 3 days. Keep the flies off it. I'll make a poultice tonight." "All right," Wyatt said. He didn't thank her profusely. He didn't act amazed that a woman with a limp could do a hard thing. He accepted her skill as a fact, and to Clara that simple acceptance felt like rain after a 10-year drought. By Thursday, Clara's muscles burned. She was hauling water from the main pump to the kitchen. 2 heavy wooden buckets. The Texas heat was brutal. It made the air shimmer. A sudden summer downpour the night before had left the yard slick in patches. Clara shifted her weight. Her left boot came down on a patch of soft, treacherous mud. Her ankle gave way. The buckets swung violently. Clara went down, hard. Water splashed everywhere, soaking her skirt, turning the dust to thick, heavy grime. Her knee slammed into a rock. The pain was sharp and bright, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold panic that seized her chest. "Not here, please, not here." It was the trauma talking. The memory of Caleb Miller staring at her. The memory of the church courtyard. Every time she had ever stumbled in town, people would gasp. They would rush over with wide, pitying eyes. "Oh, the poor crippled girl. Let me help you. You broken thing." Clara scrambled to sit up, her hands frantic in the mud, trying to hide her stained dress. Footsteps approached. Heavy boots. Wyatt. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. She braced herself for the pity. She braced herself for the sigh of a man realizing his mail-order bride was a burden. Wyatt stopped next to her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't kneel in the mud and treat her like glass. Instead, he reached down and picked up the 2 empty buckets. He pulled a clean, folded handkerchief from his back pocket and tossed it into her lap. "That ground gets soft after a storm," Wyatt said. His voice was completely normal, boring even. Clara opened her eyes. Wyatt walked away toward the barn. A minute later, he came back carrying a heavy shovel and a bucket of crushed gravel. He dumped the gravel into the mud puddle. He tamped it down flat with the back of the shovel. "Should hold now," he said. He picked up her water buckets, walked over to the pump, refilled them, and set them on the edge of the porch. Then he tipped his hat and walked back out to the fields. Clara sat in the dirt, clutching the handkerchief. He didn't fix her, because he didn't think she was broken. He fixed the mud. He treated her fall not as a tragedy of her disability, but as a simple problem with the terrain. She pressed the cloth to her face and let out a long, shuddering breath. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of falling. The kitchen was hot. Maeve was kneading bread dough. Her knuckles were white. Her red hair was escaping its bun. Clara was peeling potatoes. "He's a quiet one, the boss," Maeve said, not looking up. Quiet men either got nothing to say, or too much they were scared of saying. "He's fair," Clara said. Maeve snorted. "Fair is a low bar, girl, but it's better than most. The older woman slammed the dough onto the floured board. She leaned her weight into it. "You got grit, Clara. I'll give you that. You don't ask for permission to breathe in here. I spent my whole life asking permission," Clara said softly. "I'm tired of it, Tom." Maeve stopped kneading. She looked at Clara. Her sharp green eyes softened. "Just a fraction." "Good." Maeve pointed a flour-dusted finger at her. "Don't ever let a soul make you shrink. They did it to me when I got off the boat in Galveston. Said my voice was too loud. Said my people were nothing but drunkards in trouble. Society wants to put you in a little box so they don't have to look at you and feel uncomfortable." Maeve went back to the dough. "You have to take up space, Clara, even if they hate you for it. Because if you shrink down to fit the size they want you to be, eventually, you disappear altogether." Clara watched the knife peel away a long strip of potato skin. "I won't disappear," Clara said. Maeve smiled, a fierce, predatory grin. "No, I don't reckon you will." Friday morning. The breakfast table was quiet. Amos was drinking his coffee black. Maeve was scrubbing a skillet. Wyatt finished his eggs. He set his fork down. He looked at Clara across the table. His dark eyes were unreadable. "It's been a week," Wyatt said. The silence in the room stretched tight. Amos stopped drinking his coffee. Maeve stopped scrubbing. Clara met Wyatt's gaze. She thought about the church courtyard. She thought about the mud puddle. She thought about the gravel. She didn't need romance right now. She needed a place to stand. "I am staying," Clara said. Wyatt didn't smile, but the hard line of his jaw relaxed. "Monday," he said. "We ride into Millhaven. We sign the papers." He stood up, put his hat on, and walked out the door. Amos let out a long breath. He looked at Clara and smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "Welcome to the Sterling Ranch, Mrs. Sterling." Clara looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. The courthouse in Millhaven smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. The judge was a tired man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He mumbled through the vows. Wyatt stood beside Clara. He wore a clean shirt. His boots were polished. He didn't hold her hand, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his arm. "Do you?" "Wyatt Sterling, take this woman." "I do," Wyatt said, firm, final. "Do you, Clara Abernathy?" "I do." Wyatt slid a ring onto her finger. It wasn't gold. It was a plain band of heavy silver, no diamonds, no engravings, just a solid, unbreakable circle. They signed the ledger, that was it, no kiss. No cheering crowds, just the scratch of a pen on a page. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. When they arrived, Maeve had roasted a chicken, and Amos raised a tin cup of whiskey in a silent toast. That night they went to their separate rooms. It was an unspoken boundary. Wyatt wasn't going to force a marital right upon a woman who was still effectively a stranger. He was giving her time, giving her space. For 3 weeks it worked. They were partners in the daylight, passing ghosts in the dark. Until the 4th week. Wyatt had asked Clara to organize the ranch office. It was a small room off the parlor. Stacks of old ledgers, cattle receipts, and letters shoved haphazardly into pigeonholes. Clara liked the work. She liked the order of numbers. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The house was empty. She was sorting a stack of correspondence from the previous spring. She pulled a folded letter from the pile. The envelope was postmarked from San Antonio, addressed to Wyatt. She didn't mean to pry, but the letter was already half unfolded, and the bold, angry handwriting caught her eye. It was from a lawyer. She read the first line. Her heart did a strange, slow thump. She read the rest. "Wyatt, Hamilton is making his move on the lower pasture. He's filed the grievance in county court. You know the Texas homestead law as well as I do. Because the original deed from your father has a contested boundary. Hamilton can claim the water rights if the land isn't fully settled by a family unit. You cannot fight this as a single man. The judge will rule for Hamilton by October. You need a legal wife before autumn, Wyatt. A signature on a marriage certificate. That is the only loophole that will lock the deed and protect the lower pasture. Find a woman, any woman, marry her before the trial, or you lose the creek." Clara stopped breathing. She stared at the words. Find a woman, any woman. The paper trembled in her hand. The silence in the office was deafening. She sat back in the leather chair. The world tilted slightly on its axis, all of it, the ad in the paper, the quick marriage at the courthouse, the lack of demands. He didn't respect her grit. He didn't admire her strength. He just needed a signature. He needed a woman who was desperate enough to say yes to a stranger. A woman so broken by her own town that she wouldn't ask questions. She was convenient. She was a legal shield. The betrayal wasn't a hot, fiery anger. It was a slow, freezing ache. It felt exactly like being back in the church courtyard, being measured, weighed, and used. Clara waited. She didn't pack her bags. She didn't cry. When the sun went down, they ate dinner. Clara was silent. Wyatt didn't notice at first. He was a man accustomed to quiet. When Amos and Maeve retired for the night, Wyatt sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. Clara walked in. She placed the letter on the table, right next to his coffee cup. Wyatt looked at it. His face didn't change, his jaw just tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. He didn't feign ignorance, he didn't apologize. "I was organizing the files," Clara said. Her voice was like winter ice. Wyatt looked up at her. "I see. A legal loophole." "Wyatt, I didn't lie to you," Wyatt said. His voice was low, defensive. "The ad said the ranch needed a manager. I told you I wasn't looking for a parlor ornament. I never promised you romance." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. "No, you didn't lie." Clara stepped closer, her voice vibrating with a fierce, articulate rage. "But you hid the truth. There is a difference. You let me believe I was making a choice about my life. But you can't make a choice when someone hides the rules of the game." Wyatt stood up. He was a foot taller than her, broad and imposing. But Clara didn't back up an inch. "You took away my agency, Wyatt," Clara said, staring right into his dark eyes. "You let me believe you looked at me and saw a person, a partner. But you didn't. You looked at me and saw a deed to a pasture. You treated me exactly like the men back home did. They looked at my leg and saw a burden. You looked at my desperation and saw a tool." Wyatt opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked like a man who had just been punched in the throat. "Clara, I signed the paper," Clara said, cutting him off. "You have your lower pasture. I will do my job. I will manage your house. But do not ever pretend you did me a favor." She turned on her heel. She walked down the hall to her room. She shut the door. The click of the latch echoed through the silent house. Wyatt stood in the kitchen for a long time. The coffee went cold. The back door creaked open. Amos walked in. The older man was holding a pipe, unlit. He had been sitting on the porch. He had heard everything. The windows were open to the summer night. Amos limped over to the table. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at Wyatt. Wyatt ran a hand over his face. "Tell me I was wrong, Amos." "You were wrong," Amos said. Wyatt sighed, a harsh, ragged sound. "I didn't want to hurt her. I needed the land secure. And I knew if I told her it was just for a court case, she might not come." Amos struck a match against the table. He lit his pipe. The sweet smell of tobacco filled the room. "You didn't hide it to protect her, son," Amos said quietly. "Let's be honest about that. You hid it because you were afraid." Wyatt frowned. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid she'd say no," Amos said, blowing out a stream of smoke. "You looked at her, and you saw a girl with fire in her spine. You saw a girl who wouldn't be bought. So you tricked her into the deal instead of asking her to make it." Wyatt leaned against the counter. He stared at the closed door down the hall. "What do I do now?" Wyatt asked. Amos turned to leave. "You gave her a roof, Wyatt, but you took her pride. A roof is easy to build. Pride takes a lot longer to fix." The foreman limped out the door, leaving Wyatt alone in the dark kitchen. The house was perfectly silent. But the distance between the kitchen and Clara's bedroom suddenly felt like 1,000 miles of barren, unforgiving desert. The Texas summer did not break gently. It snapped. The heat had been building for days, a heavy, suffocating blanket that made the cattle restless and the dogs whine. Then, at 2 in the morning, the sky tore open. Thunder shook the timber frames of the ranch house. It sounded like artillery fire. Clara woke with a start. She sat up in bed. The wind was howling, battering the window panes. Rain hit the glass like handfuls of buckshot. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her left foot found the floor. The Cold War between her and Wyatt had lasted 7 days. 7 days of polite nods, 7 days of silence. They passed each other like ghosts in the hallway. Lightning flashed. A brilliant, jagged white light. In that split second of illumination, Clara saw it, a faint orange glow, swinging wildly out by the southern fence line. Wyatt. The storm was pushing the panicked herd toward the barbed wire. If they stampeded, they would tear themselves to ribbons. Clara didn't think about the letter in the office. She didn't think about the cold silence. She stood up. She pulled a heavy wool shawl over her nightgown and shoved her feet into her boots. She walked out to the mudroom. Wyatt's heavy yellow oilskin coat was hanging on its peg. He had rushed out without it. She grabbed the coat. She pushed the back door open. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The rain was blinding. It came sideways, stinging her face. Clara put her head down. She leaned her weight into her bad leg, anchoring herself against the gale, and marched toward the swinging lantern. She found him waist-deep in the mud. Wyatt was fighting the wind, trying to retie a snapped fence post. His shirt was plastered to his skin. He was shivering, his dark hair plastered across his forehead. He was straining against the heavy timber, but the mud was slick. He was losing his footing. Clara stepped up beside him. She didn't yell over the wind. She just dropped the oilskin coat on the nearest dry bale, grabbed the slick rope and pulled. Wyatt jerked his head. He saw her through the sheet of rain. He didn't yell at her to go back inside. He didn't tell her it was too dangerous. He saw her grip the rope. He saw her brace her uneven boots in the mud. He shifted his grip, gave a sharp nod, and they pulled together. For an hour they fought the storm. They didn't speak, they moved in perfect, brutal synchronization. When she needed slack, he gave it. When he needed leverage, she leaned her whole body against the post. They were a machine, a partnership forged in mud and lightning. By 3 in the morning, the fence held. The herd had backed away from the wire, huddled tight in the center of the pasture. Wyatt grabbed the lantern. He pointed toward the main barn. They ran for the heavy double doors, slipping in the muck, and shoved them shut against the wind. The inside of the barn was pitch black, save for the lantern. It smelled of dry hay, wet leather, and horse sweat. The air was calm here. The storm sounded like a distant war. Clara stood shivering. Her nightgown was soaked through. Her hair hung in heavy, wet ropes. Wyatt picked up the oilskin coat she had brought. He walked over. He didn't hand it to her. He wrapped it around her shoulders. His knuckles brushed her collarbone. His hands were freezing. "You shouldn't have come out here," Wyatt said. His voice was hoarse. "You would have lost the fence," Clara said. Her teeth were chattering. "I would have managed. You didn't have to." They stood inches apart in the golden lantern light. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the cold, angry silence of the past week. It was heavy, breathing. Wyatt stepped back. He ran a trembling hand through his wet hair. He walked over to a stack of hay bales and sat down. He put his head in his hands. He looked entirely defeated. "I didn't trick you just for the land, Clara," Wyatt whispered. Clara pulled the heavy coat tighter around herself. She didn't interrupt. "I needed the land." "That's true," Wyatt said, staring at the dirt floor. "But I could have fought the case. I could have hired better lawyers. I placed that ad because it was safe." He looked up at her. His dark eyes were haunted. "My father built this ranch," Wyatt said slowly. The words felt like they were being dragged over glass. He was a respected man in town, tipped his hat, paid his debts, but inside the house, Wyatt swallowed hard. He was a monster. He drank, and when he drank, he used his fists on me, but mostly on my mother. Class breath hitched. She walked over slowly and sat on the bale next to him. Not touching, just present. "I was 14 the first time I tried to stop him," Wyatt continued. "He hit me so hard I woke up the next afternoon. When I was 17, I woke up and the house was quiet. My mother was gone. Her clothes were gone. My father told the town she off with a traveling salesman, left us behind." Wyatt's voice cracked. "I hated her for it. For 6 years I hated her for leaving me with him. He died of a ruined liver when I was 19, left me the ranch and a mountain of debt. I fixed it. I built this place back up." He reached into his wet shirt pocket. He pulled out a folded, water-stained piece of paper. "It looked years old. A year ago I got this. From a woman in Waco. It was my mother." Wyatt looked at Clara. "She didn't run off with a salesman, Clara. She ran for her life. He beat her so badly that night she knew the next one would kill her. She tried to come back for me. She sent letters. He burned them all. She only found out he died a year ago." The barn was silent, only the rain drumming on the roof. "I am my father's son," Wyatt said. The terror in his voice was absolute. "Naked. I have his blood. I have his temper. Every time I get angry, every time I feel a spark of rage, I see his face in the mirror. I am terrified of what I might do if I ever lose control." He looked at his own hands like they were weapons. "That is why I placed the ad. That is why I married a stranger. Because I thought if I didn't love you, if I kept my distance, I couldn't hurt you. I chose a business deal because I was terrified of being a husband." Clara looked at this massive, strong, broken man. She didn't reach out to stroke his hair. She didn't offer him sweet, meaningless platitudes. She gave him the respect of the hard truth. "Look at me." "Wyatt," Clara commanded quietly. He looked up. "A monster never fears becoming a monster," Clara said. Her voice was steady, cutting through the shadows of the barn. "A monster thinks he is right. A monster believes his anger is justified." She pointed a finger at his chest. "You are carrying the weight of a sin you haven't committed. You are locking yourself inside a cage your father built. And you threw away the key because you re-scared of the door. But you are not him." "How do you know?" Wyatt whispered. "Because a monster wouldn't have shoveled gravel into a mud puddle so I wouldn't fall again," Clara said simply. Wyatt stared at her. The breath shuddered out of his lungs in a long, ragged exhale. He closed his eyes. The tension that had held his shoulders rigid for a decade finally seemed to snap. They sat together in the barn until the dawn broke. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. When they finally stood up to walk back to the house, the ground was a mess of deep, slick mud. Clara walked carefully. Her heavy boots sank deep into the muck. She wobbled, her bad leg struggling to find purchase. Wyatt was a step ahead of her. He stopped. He didn't turn around. He simply reached his right hand backward, offering it to her. He didn't look back to check if she needed it. He just held it there, a steady, immovable anchor. Clara looked at his broad back. She looked at his hand. She reached out and wrapped her fingers around his. He pulled her gently forward, guiding her over the worst of the mud. When they reached the solid wood of the back porch, they stopped. The danger was past. The mud was gone. But Wyatt didn't let go of her hand, and Clara didn't pull away. They stood there for 3 full seconds, holding on, feeling the rough calluses. The warmth of the skin, the quiet, terrifying promise of a new beginning. August came in hot and dry. The prairie grass turned the color of old gold. The ranch settled into a steady, productive rhythm. The Cold War was over. Wyatt and Clara spoke more now. They lingered over coffee in the mornings. They discussed cattle prices. They hadn't spoken about the barn. But the air between them had softened. It felt like holding your breath just before the music starts then. On a Tuesday, Dr. Julian Mercer arrived. He rode a sturdy gray gelding, carrying 2 worn leather saddlebags full of medical instruments. Mercer was a traveling physician, a man in his late 50s, educated back east, who spent his life riding the brutal Texas circuit to treat isolated ranch families. Wyatt had sent for him. Amos' bad leg had been aching fiercely since the storm. Clara boiled water and brought clean rags to the parlor, while Dr. Mercer examined the old foreman. When the doctor finished binding Amos' knee, he snapped his bag shut. He stood up, wiping his hands on a towel. That was when Mercer stopped. He looked at Clara. He watched her walk across the room to collect the empty basin. He watched the heavy drop of her hip, the way she threw her weight to compensate for the shorter left leg. Mercer didn't look away politely. He watched with intense clinical fascination. Clara stiffened. She knew that look. It was the look of a man measuring a broken chair to see if it could be fixed. "Mrs. Sterling," Dr. Mercer said. His voice was gentle, but sharp with intellect. "Forgive my intrusion. But may I ask about your gait?" Clara set the basin down. Her spine went rigid. "Scarlet fever when I was 7. Mercer nodded slowly, and the bone simply stopped growing in pace with the right. "Yes." Wyatt stepped into the room. He stood near the door, his eyes darting between the doctor and his wife. He sensed the sudden tension in her shoulders. "I spent 2 years in Europe recently," Dr. Mercer said, stepping closer. "Studying in Germany. There is a new procedure, Mrs. Sterling. An osteotomy." The room went dead silent. "What is that?" Amos asked from the armchair. "It is a surgery," Mercer explained, his eyes alight with medical passion. "We break the bone, we realign it, insert a wedge, and allow it to heal at the proper length. It takes months in a cast. It is painful, but I have seen people walk away with barely a limp." He looked right at Clara. "I believe I could fix your leg, Mrs. Sterling." The word hit the air like a gunshot. "Fix." Wyatt looked at Clara. Amos looked at Clara. Clara looked at the floor. She had spent 11 years dreaming of a miracle. She had prayed for it as a child. She had begged God to stretch her bone, to make her normal, so the other children would stop staring. But right now, standing in the parlor of the ranch she helped run, the offer didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like an insult. "I see," Clara said quietly. Her voice was perfectly flat. She picked up the basin and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. Wyatt found her an hour later. She was in the tack room, furiously scrubbing a leather saddle with saddle soap. Her hands were moving so fast her knuckles were white. Wyatt leaned against the door frame. He didn't speak. He just let her work it out. "He thinks I need fixing," Clara said to the leather, her voice shaking with sudden violent anger. Wyatt stayed quiet. He knew she wasn't asking a question. She was processing a lifetime of grief. Clara threw the rag into the bucket. Water splashed onto her boots. "Why does my body offend them so much?" Clara demanded, turned to look at Wyatt. There were tears in her eyes, but they were tears of pure fury. "I can cook, I can ride, I can stitch a horse and balance a ledger. But a man with a medical degree walks into my house, and the first thing he sees is a mistake that needs to be erased." Wyatt crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from her. "He's a doctor, Clara. He fixes things. That's how he sees the world. But how do you see me?" Clara asked. It was the most vulnerable question she had ever asked him. Wyatt looked down at her. His dark eyes were fierce and completely steady. "I see the woman who saved my southern fence line in a thunderstorm," Wyatt said slowly. "I see the woman who runs this ranch as well as I do." Clara swallowed hard. "But if I could walk straight, wouldn't you want that?" Wyatt took a half step closer. If you want the surgery because your hip hurts when it rains, then I will pay the doctor right now, Wyatt said. His voice left absolutely no room for doubt. But, Wyatt continued, if you want the surgery because you think it will make you more acceptable to me, or to the gossips in town, then I will throw that doctor off my property, because you don't owe the world a perfect stride, Clara. Make sure the voice you're listening to is your own, not the voices of the three fools who walked away from you. Clara stared at him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He wasn't telling her what to do. He was giving her back the pen that evening. Clara sat on the front porch. The sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. She heard the heavy, uneven thud of Amos's boots behind her. The old foreman lowered himself into the rocking chair next to her. He lit his pipe. Mercer offered to cut my knee open 5 years ago, Amos said quietly to the twilight. Said he could scrape the joint, make me walk smoother. Clara looked at him. Why didn't you let him? Amos puffed on his pipe. A cloud of sweet smoke drifted into the hot air. Because I earned this limp at Gettysburg, Amos said. It reminds me that I survived a day when a lot of good men didn't. He looked over at Clara. Your limp is different. You didn't ask for it, but it shaped you all the same. It gave you that iron in your spine. Amos leaned forward. Society expects folks like us to want to be cured, because our brokenness reminds them that the world ain't safe. They want you fixed for their comfort, Clara, not for your. So you think I shouldn't do it, Clara asked. I think, Amos said, tapping his pipe against the railing, that whatever you do it as an act of freedom. If you keep the limp, keep it out of pride. If you take the surgery, take it because you want to dance. But don't do a damn thing just to make the neighbors comfortable. Amos stood up. He tipped his hat and limped back inside. Clara sat on the porch until the stars came out. She looked down at her boots. She thought about the pain in her hip on cold mornings. She thought about the stairs in the churchyard. Then she thought about Wyatt holding her hand in the mud. She stood up. She walked into the house, into the office, and lit a lamp. She pulled a piece of heavy parchment from the desk and dipped a pen in ink. Dear Dr. Mercer, I appreciate your generous offer, however. I must ask for time to consider. I have spent my entire life viewing my leg through the eyes of people who pitied me, until I can look at my own body and decide what I want for myself, independent of their stares. I will not allow a knife to touch my skin. My body belongs to me. I will let you know when I have made my choice. Sincerely, Clara Sterling. She folded the letter, she sealed it. She stood up from the desk. She walked down the hallway to her bedroom. One heavy step, one light step. For the very first time in her 18 years of life, the sound of her own footsteps didn't sound like an apology. It sounded like a drumbeat. September in Brazos County smelled of dry dust and curing hay. The heat had lost its brutal summer edge, leaving behind a sharp, golden light that made the prairie look like a painting. Clara stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the Millhaven Mercantile. She was waiting for Wyatt. He was inside settling the account for winter feed. Clara didn't look like the girl from the churchyard anymore. Maeve had helped her sew a new dress from a bolt of deep blue cotton. It fit perfectly. Her hair was pinned back neatly. But the biggest change wasn't the clothes. It was the way she stood. She didn't hunch. She didn't try to hide her left boot behind her right. She stood square to the street, letting the world look if it wanted to. A bell jingled. The door of the telegraph office across the street swung open. A man stepped out. He wore a tailored gray suit and a pristine Stetson. Elias Vance. Clara recognized the golden boy immediately. He stepped off the curb, dodging a passing wagon, and started across the dirt road. He hadn't seen her yet. He was busy checking his pocket watch. Then he looked up. He stopped dead in the middle of the street. Clara didn't look away. She met his gaze with the calm, flat indifference of a stranger. Elias blinked. He looked at her blue dress. He looked at the confident set of her shoulders. Then he looked at the sign above her head. Sterling Ranch accounts welcome here. He crossed the street. He stepped onto the boardwalk. He took off his hat. Clara, Elias said. His voice was breathless. Surprised, I mean, Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Vance. Clara replied evenly. Elias looked her up and down. It wasn't a respectful look. It was the look of a man realizing he had sold a piece of land right before someone found gold on it. You look. Elias stumbled over the word. You look beautiful. I look the exact same as I did in June. Elias, I'm just wearing better cotton. Elias flushed. He looked down at his expensive boots, then back up. He stepped a fraction closer. The smell of his bay rum cologne was suffocating. I made a mistake, Elias said in a low, hurried whisper. That day at the church, my mother, she can be overbearing. She caught me off guard, but I never stopped thinking about you, about how sharp you are, How sweet. The mercantile door opened with a rattle. Wyatt stepped out. He was carrying a 50-pound sack of flour on one shoulder like it weighed nothing. He stopped. He saw Elias. He saw how close the man was standing to his wife. Wyatt didn't drop the sack. He didn't puff out his chest and yell. He simply walked over, set the heavy sack down in the bed of their wagon, and turned around. Wyatt stepped up onto the boardwalk. He didn't step in front of Clara to shield her. He stepped beside her, shoulder to shoulder. He was letting her fight her own battle, but making it perfectly clear that she had an army at her back if she needed it. Elias swallowed hard. He looked at Wyatt's broad shoulders and the dark, quiet menace in his eyes. "Sterling," Elias nodded nervously. "Vance," Wyatt said, a single syllable, heavy as a falling tree. Elias turned his attention back to Clara, desperate to reclaim the moment. "I just wanted you to know, Clara, if things were different, if I hadn't let my mother speak for me, we could have had a good life." He was offering her a tragedy, a romantic what-if. He wanted her to sigh, to look at him with tragic longing, to validate his ego by showing she still wanted him. Clara looked at Elias Vance, and she felt nothing but a profound, exhausting pity. "You didn't reject a Limp, Elias," Clara said. Her voice rang out, clear and steady over the noise of the street. "You rejected me, the whole of me." Elias took a step back, stunned by the cold iron in her tone. "And now," Clara continued, not raising her voice, but making sure every word cut bone deep, "you are standing here mourning a trophy you threw away, simply because you see someone else has polished it. That isn't love, that is vanity." Elias opened his mouth, his face burning red. "Clara, a man who has to hide behind his mother's skirts to make a choice about his own life is not a man," Clara interrupted. "He is a boy playing dress-up, and I have no use for boys." Silence dropped over the boardwalk. A man loading barrels nearby actually stopped to stare. Elias looked like he had been slapped. He put his hat back on, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't look at Wyatt. He turned on his heel and walked fast down the boardwalk, disappearing into the crowd. Wyatt watched him go. Then, Wyatt looked down at Clara. The corner of his mouth twitched. It was the closest thing to a full smile she had ever seen on his face. "You want me to load the sugar next?" Wyatt asked, as if she hadn't just dismantled the richest man in town. "Yes, please," Clara said. Wyatt nodded. He walked back into the store. Clara stood in the sunlight. She took a deep breath. The Texas air had never tasted so sweet. The backlash arrived the next afternoon. It came in the form of a polished black carriage pulled by two matched gray geldings. It rolled up the dusty drive of the Sterling ranch, stopping right in front of the porch. Wyatt was out on the north ridge. Amos was in the barn. Clara was on the porch, snapping green beans into a tin bowl. The carriage door opened. The driver hopped down and offered his hand. Martha Vance stepped out. She wore black silk in 90-degree heat. A parasol shielded her pale face from the sun. She looked around the working ranch, the dust, the chicken coop, the manure piles with a look of profound, aristocratic disgust. Then she marched up to the porch. Clara didn't stand up. She kept snapping beans. Snap, drop, Mrs. Sterling, Martha said. Her voice was like poisoned honey. "Mrs. Vance, you're a long way from the paved roads of Clover Creek." Martha closed her parasol with a sharp snap. "I will get right to the point. My son came home yesterday in a terrible state. He was drinking. He muttered something about seeing you in town." Clara picked up another bean. "He did. I know what you were doing," Martha hissed. Dropping the polite facade, she took a step closer, towering over Clara's chair. "You think because you managed to trap a debt-ridden rancher into marrying you, you suddenly have status. You think you can bat your eyes at my Elias and make him regret his choices. You want to ruin his current courtship just to spite me." Clara stopped snapping beans. She looked up at the older woman. She saw the desperate, clawing need for control in Martha's eyes. She saw a mother who had suffocated her son so thoroughly that she now had to fight his imaginary battles for him. Clara set the tin bowl aside. She stood up, slowly. She let her weight settle heavily onto her left boot. She stood as tall as she could. "I am going to say this once, Mrs. Vance, so I suggest you listen." Martha took a half-step back, startled by the sheer force radiating from the girl. "I do not want your son. I never wanted your son. I wanted a man who had the courage to look at my flaws and see a partner, not a liability. You didn't save Elias from me, you saved me from him." Martha's face turned the color of spoiled milk. "How dare you speak to me? You have ruined that boy," Clara continued, her voice deadly calm. "You made him a coward, and a coward will never know how to love anyone. Not me, not whatever poor girl you choose for him next. You can take your carriage and your silk dresses, and you can leave my property, because if you ever come back here and insult my husband or my home again, I won't use my words. I will use the shotgun behind the door. Martha Vance stared. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on a riverbank. She looked around. There was no one to appeal to. No society ladies to back her up. Just the wind, the dust, and a girl with a spine made of steel. Martha turned, hoisted her silk skirts, and practically fled into her carriage. The driver cracked the whip. The horses bolted down the drive, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. Clara watched them go. She sat back down, picked up her tin bowl, and went back to snapping beans. An hour later, Wyatt rode into the yard. He tied his horse to the post. He walked up the steps, dusting off his jeans with his hat. He stopped and looked at the deep, frantic carriage ruts cut into the dirt driveway. He looked at Clara. "We have company. Martha Vance," Clara said. Wyatt went dead still. His eyes darkened instantly. "Did she touch you?" "No." "Did she threaten you?" "She tried to. Told me to stay away from her son." Wyatt let out a low, angry breath. "I should have been here. I didn't need you here, Wyatt." Clara looked up at him. She smiled, a real bright smile. She didn't recount the argument to seek his validation. She didn't need him to tell her she was brave. She just wanted to share the victory. "Were you scared?" Wyatt asked quietly, stepping closer to her chair. Clara looked out over the vast, sweeping acreage of the Sterling Ranch. She looked at the barn where they had fought the storm. She looked at the mud puddle that now held solid gravel. "No," Clara said softly. "I wasn't scared. Why not?" Clara looked up into his dark, steady eyes. "Because," she said, "I was standing inside my own home." Wyatt stared at her. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair. He reached out, his rough fingers brushing her cheek as he tucked the hair behind her ear. "Yes, you were," Wyatt whispered. October brought a chill to the mornings and a heavy tension to the ranch. The Hamilton land dispute had finally reached the county courthouse. The courtroom in Millhaven was packed. Townspeople loved a spectacle, especially when it involved two large ranches fighting over water rights. Cornelius Hamilton sat at the plaintiff's table. He was a rich, fat man who wore a gold pocket watch and a smug smile. His lawyer was a sharp-eyed man from Austin who looked like a hungry hawk. Wyatt sat at the defense table. Clara sat beside him. Their lawyer was a sweaty, nervous man named Higgins. Wyatt had hired him because Higgins was cheap, and all of Wyatt's money was tied up in winter feed. The trial began at 9. By 11 it was going badly. The hawk from Austin paced in front of the judge. "Your Honor, the Homestead Act of 1876 clearly states that contested boundaries fall to the party with the oldest continuous improvement." The lawyer barked. "Mr. Sterling claims his father built the lower fence in 1869. But there is no proof of that original boundary line. Without the addendum to the original deed, the claim is void." The judge looked over his spectacles at Higgins' counselor. "Do you have the 1869 addendum?" Higgins began frantically digging through a massive, disorganized pile of papers on his desk. He was sweating through his suit. I know I have it, Your Honor. I saw it last week. Just give me a moment." Hamilton chuckled softly. Wyatt's jaw locked. He stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden table, so hard his knuckles were white. He was watching his father's ranch, the land he had bled for, slip through his fingers because of a misplaced piece of paper. Clara didn't panic. She looked at Higgins' messy pile. The night before, she had stayed up until midnight by the oil lamp. She had gone through every single ledger, every receipt, every letter in Wyatt's office. She had memorized the dates. She recognized the color of the parchment. She reached her hand over. She didn't ask Higgins for permission. She bypassed the lawyer entirely. Her fingers skimmed the edge of the stack. She pulled out a heavy yellowed piece of paper folded in thirds. It had slipped inside a cattle invoice. She didn't hand it to the lawyer. She didn't shrink back. She slid the paper directly across the table, placing it right in front of Wyatt's hands. She tapped it once with her index finger. Wyatt looked down. It was the 1869 addendum, stamped, signed, ironclad. Wyatt picked it up. He didn't hand it to Higgins either. He stood up. "Your Honor," Wyatt said, his voice ringing loud and clear in the silent courtroom. "The defense submits the 1869 boundary addendum, secured and archived by my wife, Mrs. Sterling." He walked the paper up to the judge's bench. The hawk from Austin deflated. Hamilton stopped smiling. The judge adjusted his spectacles. "Read the paper," and banged his gavel. "Case dismissed. The boundary stands. Sterling retains the lower pasture." The courtroom erupted into whispers. Wyatt walked back to the table. He didn't cheer. He didn't shake Higgins' hand. He sat down next to Clara. He turned his body entirely toward her. He looked at her hands folded neatly in her lap. Then he looked at her face. "Thank you," Wyatt said. 2 words, but they carried the weight of the world. He wasn't thanking her for finding a paper. He was thanking her for being his anchor, for standing shoulder to shoulder with him in the mud, in the barn, and in the courtroom. He was acknowledging in front of God and the entire town of Millhaven that he could not survive without her. Clara smiled. "You're welcome, partner." They rode back to the ranch in the golden afternoon light. The tension that had plagued Wyatt for months was gone. The land was safe. The ranch was theirs. When the wagon pulled up to the house, Amos was standing on the porch. He held a small yellow piece of paper in his hand, a telegram. Wyatt pulled the horses up. He saw the look on Amos' face. The old foreman didn't look triumphant about the court victory. He looked grave. "Amos?" Wyatt asked, stepping down. Amos walked forward and handed the paper to Clara. "Boy from town wrote it out 10 minutes ago," Amos said softly. "It's from Clover Creek, Clara. It's your brother." Clara's heart dropped. She unfolded the yellow paper. "Pa fell in the field. Doctor says a stroke. Weak but alive. Need you, Toby." The paper fluttered in Clara's hand. Her father, the man who had cut out the newspaper ad, the man who had traded his pride to give her a chance at a life. She stood frozen in the wagon bed, 100 miles away. It would take 2 days by hard riding, 3 by stagecoach. Wyatt didn't ask to read the telegram. He saw her face. He saw the tears spring to her eyes. He turned immediately to Amos. Wyatt didn't deliberate. He didn't say, "We just won a court case. I have too much work to do." He didn't say, "I'll buy you a train ticket." "Saddle the black gelding," Wyatt ordered, his voice cracking like a whip, "and hitch the fast buggy. Put 2 canteens in and tell Maeve to pack salt meat and bread. We leave in 10 minutes. Amos nodded and took off in a limping run toward the barn. Wyatt turned back to Clara. He reached up, grabbed her waist, and lifted her down from the wagon. "Go pack a bag," he said gently. "I've got the horses. Wyatt, you don't have to go." Clara choked out. The ranch will stand," Wyatt said, his dark eyes fierce. "That is your father. I am going with you." Love wasn't a poem. It wasn't a sweet whisper in the dark. Love was a man hitching a buggy in 10 minutes to ride 100 miles into the dark because your heart was breaking. They rode through the night. They pushed the horses hard, sleeping in the buggy for a few hours at dawn, and pushed on. By the evening of the second day, they rolled into Clover Creek. The Abernathy cabin looked smaller than Clara remembered. The paint was peeling worse. The porch sagged. Toby ran out the front door as the buggy pulled up. The 14-year-old boy looked exhausted, his eyes bruised with lack of sleep. Clara jumped down before the buggy even stopped. She caught her brother in a fierce hug. "He's awake," Toby mumbled into her shoulder, "but he can't move his left side much." Clara pulled back. She looked at Wyatt. He was tying the horses to the post, giving her a nod to go inside. Clara walked into the dark cabin. Silas lay in the small bed in the corner. He looked withered. The stroke had pulled the left side of his face down. His breathing was shallow. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. She took his rough, calloused hand paw. She whispered, "I'm here." Silas opened his eyes. The right eye was clear. He squeezed her hand weakly. He tried to speak, but the words were a slurred mumble. Then the floorboards creaked. Wyatt took his hat off and stepped into the small room. He looked massive in the tiny cabin. He walked over and stood right behind Clara's chair. He placed a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. Silas' eyes shifted. He looked at the stranger. He looked at Wyatt's broad shoulders. He looked at the heavy silver ring on Clara's finger. Then he looked at Wyatt's face. Silas swallowed hard. He fought for the words. He forced his mouth to work. "Are you good to my girl?" Silas slurred, his voice desperate. It was the question of a dying man who had gambled his daughter's life on a piece of newsprint. Wyatt didn't puff out his chest. He didn't list his acreage or brag about his bank account. He didn't claim to be a perfect hero. He looked down at Clara, then back to her father. "I am a flawed man, Mr. Abernathy," Wyatt said. His voice was incredibly gentle, filling the small room with absolute truth. "But your daughter has taught me how to stand up straight. I promise you this before God. I am learning how to be better every single day." Silas looked at the rancher. He looked at the heavy hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. The old man let out a long sigh. The tension drained from his face. He closed his eyes, and a small, crooked smile touched the right side of his mouth. He squeezed Clara's hand one last time and drifted into a peaceful sleep. Clara reached up and covered Wyatt's hand on her shoulder with her own. They had built a life on paper, but standing in the dark cabin, Clara knew the truth. They weren't strangers anymore. They were bound by mud and storms and the quiet courage of showing up. November in Texas brought a sharp, clean cold. The heat of the summer was finally dead. The sky was a pale, blinding blue. The wind smelled of dry pine and distant rain. Clara and Wyatt were on the wagon, heading home. Home. The word felt different now. They had spent 2 weeks in Clover Creek. Silas had survived the stroke. He was weak. His left side dragged a little when he walked. He would never plow a field again. But he was alive. And more importantly, he was at peace. Toby had stepped up. The 14-year-old boy had grown shoulders overnight. A neighbor had agreed to help with the heavy lifting, but Toby was running the house. He wasn't a boy anymore. When the wagon crested the final ridge in Brazos County, Clara sat up straighter. There it was, Sterling Ranch. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. Maeve was cooking, out by the corral. Amos was leaning against the fence, a cup of coffee in his hand. Watching the new colts, Clara looked at the timber house. She didn't feel the nervous knot in her stomach that she had felt in June. She didn't wonder if she belonged. She had bled for this dirt. She had fought for this house. She had chosen it. Wyatt pulled the team to a halt by the porch. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. His dark eyes soft in the autumn light. He reached over and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His thumb brushed her cheek. A quiet welcome. They went inside. The house was warm. Maeve grumbled about them tracking dust onto her clean floors. But the Irish cook hugged Clara so hard her ribs ached. That afternoon, Clara sat at the desk in the ranch office. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She dipped her pen in the inkwell. It was time to finish the business she had started in the summer. She wrote to Dr. Julian Mercer. Dear Dr. Mercer, I am writing to give you my final answer regarding the osteotomy. I will not be coming to Austin for the surgery. She paused. She looked out the window. She watched Wyatt walking across the yard, his long, even stride eating up the distance. She looked down at the paper and kept writing. I spent my whole life believing my body was a mistake. I thought my worth was tied to how well I could walk in a straight line. But a broken bone does not make a broken woman. I have found a life where I am measured by the work of my hands and the strength of my character. I do not need to be fixed, doctor, because I am no longer broken. I am keeping my limp. It belongs to me. It reminds me of what I have survived. She signed her name, Clara Sterling. She folded the letter. She felt a massive weight lift from her chest. The ghost of the church courtyard was finally permanently gone. That evening, the house was quiet. Amos and Maeve had retired to their rooms. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing red embers. Clara stepped out onto the front porch. The night air was biting. She pulled her woolen shawl tight around her shoulders. Wyatt was already there. He was leaning against the wooden railing, looking out at the dark prairie. He held a tin cup of coffee. He heard her uneven footsteps on the porch boards, but he didn't turn around right away. Clara walked over. She stood next to him. They stood in silence for a long time. It was the good kind of silence, the kind you only share with someone who knows all your ghosts. I mailed the letter to the doctor today, Clara said to the night. I told him no. Wyatt turned his head. He looked at her profile in the moonlight. You're sure? I'm sure. Wyatt nodded slowly. He took a sip of his coffee. Then he set the tin cup down on the railing. He turned his body fully toward her. I have a confession to make, Wyatt said. His voice was a low rumble. Clara looked up. Another one. The last one, Wyatt promised. He stepped a fraction closer. The heat radiating from him cut through the November chill. When I placed that ad in the paper, I told myself it was just for the land, Wyatt said softly. And when your father's letter came, I told myself I was picking you because it was a smart business move. A girl from a poor family with a bad leg wouldn't demand a grand romance. She would just be grateful for the roof. Clara didn't flinch. She already knew this part. But that was a lie, Wyatt whispered. He reached out. He took her hands in his. His large, rough fingers swallowed hers completely. I didn't pick you because you were easy, Clara. I picked you because I read your father's words. And I realized how much courage it took for a woman like you to step onto a stagecoach and face a stranger. I was a coward, hiding on my ranch, terrified of my own shadow. I didn't want a woman who was grateful. I wanted a woman who was brave. I wanted someone who could teach me how to stop running. Clara stared at him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. You didn't need fixing, Clara. Wyatt said, his voice thick with raw emotion. I did, and you fixed me. He didn't wait for her to answer. He let go of her hands. He reached up and cupped her face. His calloused thumbs traced her cheekbones. He leaned down, slow, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Clara closed her eyes and met him halfway. The kiss wasn't a sudden, fiery explosion. It was better than that. It was deep, steady, unshakable. It tasted like coffee and cold night air and absolute safety. When they finally pulled apart, Wyatt kept his forehead resting against hers. They were both breathing hard. I love you, Clara whispered. It was the first time she had ever said the words to a man. They felt right. They felt earned. Wyatt smiled, a real full smile that reached his dark eyes. "I love you, Clara," he said. "I just needed to learn how to say it." The next morning was bright and painfully clear. Breakfast was over. Amos was heading out to the barn. Maeve was shaking out a rug on the porch. Clara walked out the front door, carrying a basket to collect eggs from the coop. "Clara, wait." Wyatt was standing at the bottom of the porch steps. He was wearing his work boots, his denim trousers, and a clean white shirt. He took off his hat and tossed it onto a nearby chair. Clara stopped at the edge of the top step. "What is it?" Wyatt walked up the wooden stairs. He stopped on the step just below hers, so they were exactly eye level. "The day you arrived here," Wyatt said loudly enough for Amos and Maeve to hear. "You walked through that front door alone. I treated it like a business deal. I didn't give you the welcome a wife deserves." Amos stopped walking. He leaned heavily on his cane, watching. Maeve lowered the rug. She wiped her hands on her apron, her sharp eyes suddenly shining. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Wyatt, you don't have to. I want to," Wyatt said firmly. He didn't drop to one knee. He didn't make a speech about her leg. He didn't apologize for the past. He was simply rewriting the beginning of their story. Wyatt stepped up. He slid his right arm behind her back. He slipped his left arm under her knees. With one smooth, effortless motion, he lifted her off the ground. Clara gasped, her arms instinctively flying up to wrap around his thick neck. She felt the incredible, solid strength of his chest against hers. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't heavy. He held her like she was the most valuable thing he had ever touched. He looked down into her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sterling," Wyatt whispered. He turned. He carried her across the wooden porch. He didn't rush. He carried her with reverence. He stepped over the wooden threshold, passing through the heavy front door, and brought her into the warmth of the house, out on the porch. Amos Thorne smiled. The old soldier brought his weathered hands together in a slow, single clap. Maeve didn't clap, she just sniffled loudly, muttered something in Gaelic about the dust in the air, and scrubbed her eyes fiercely with the corner of her apron. Inside the hallway, Wyatt set Clara down. Gently. Her right boot touched the floor, then her left. She stood on her own 2 feet, but she didn't let go of his neck. She pulled him down and kissed him again, fierce and joyful. The threshold was crossed. The ghosts were dead. They were finally, truly, home. Epilogue February 1880. The winter sun was pale, casting long shadows across the kitchen table. Clara sat by the window. She had a pen in her hand and a piece of paper in front of her. Her left hand rested on her stomach. It was round and heavy. She was 7 months pregnant. She dipped the pen in the ink and wrote, "Dear Toby, the winter here isn't as bitter as it is in Clover Creek, but the wind still bites. Maeve taught me how to bake Irish soda bread yesterday. I burned the first loaf, but she said my second was passable. Amos taught me how to play poker. He cheats, but he refuses to admit it." Clara paused. She looked out the kitchen window. Wyatt was out on the front porch. He was holding a hammer and a mouth full of nails. He had his coat off despite the chill, his sleeves rolled up, revealing his muscular forearms. He wasn't fixing the roof. He was ripping out the steep wooden steps that led up to the porch. In their place, he was building a gentle, sloping wooden ramp. He hadn't said a word about it. He hadn't made a big show of his sacrifice. He just noticed that as Clara's pregnancy progressed, the steep steps were making her bad hip ache at the end of the day. Implicit education. He didn't try to fix her leg. He just fixed the house so it fit her better. He changed the world around her so she wouldn't have to strain. Clara smiled. A deep, warm ache spread through her chest. She looked back at the letter. "You asked me in your last letter if I am happy. I thought about that for a long time, Toby. I think people get happiness wrong. They think it's a miracle. They think it's waking up one day with all your problems gone and a perfect body. But that isn't it. Happiness is something you build with your own 2 hands. It is hard work. It is telling the truth even when your voice shakes. It is refusing to let the world make you small." She shifted in her chair. The baby kicked against her ribs. "I still walk with a limp, Toby. Dr. Mercer still sends a letter every 6 months, reminding me his door is open. I throw them in the fire. I do not need a knife to give me my dignity. Wyatt knows about the letters. He doesn't say anything. He just kisses my forehead and goes out to work the cattle. He is a good man, the best I have ever known. He is terrified of being a father. But last night I caught him talking to my stomach when he thought I was asleep. He was telling the baby how to saddle a horse. If it is a boy, we are naming him Silas. If it is a girl, we will name her Hope, because that is what we built here out of the dirt. Those men in Clover Creek taught me a hard lesson, Toby. but they taught me the right one. Not everyone who walks away from you is a tragedy. Sometimes they are just clearing the path for the person who is actually meant to walk beside you. Give Pa my love. Tell him I keep his newspaper clipping in my jewelry box. Forever your sister, Clara Sterling. Clara signed her name with a flourish. She folded the paper. She set the pen down. She stood up from the table. The extra weight of the baby made her left leg ache a little more than usual. She rested her hand on her lower back, stretching. She walked over to the window and pushed it open. The crisp February air rushed in. Out on the porch, Wyatt heard the sound. He stopped hammering. He looked up from the wooden ramp. He saw her framed in the kitchen window. The rugged, stoic rancher didn't smile right away. He just looked at her. He looked at the heavy curve of her belly. He looked at the confident set of her shoulders. He looked at her exactly the way a starving man looks at a feast. Then he raised the hammer in his right hand, a silent, singular salute. Clara raised her ink-stained hand and waved back. She turned away from the window and walked back across the kitchen to start the coffee. One heavy step, one light step, a perfect, unbreakable rhythm. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.
And so, as the pale winter sun settles over the Sterling Ranch, and Clara's uneven footsteps move through the kitchen in that steady, unbreakable rhythm, we come to the end of a story that was never truly about a limp. It was about the world's cruel habit of looking at one visible flaw and deciding it knows the whole value of a human soul. Clara Jane Abernathy spent most of her young life being measured by the way she walked. Men looked at her boot before they looked at her face. They judged her future by the tilt of her hip, her worth by the sound of one heavy step and one light step. But this story reminds us that a person is never the sum of what others pity. Clara was never broken. She was simply forced to live in a world too narrow to understand her strength. At the beginning, Clara is rejected not because she lacks kindness, intelligence, courage, or skill, but because society cannot see past her body. The men who turn away from her reveal more about themselves than they ever reveal about her. Caleb wants a whole woman to work his fields, as if usefulness were the only measure of a wife. Hiram wants a woman who will not embarrass his reputation, as if marriage were nothing more than a public display. Elias lets his mother's judgment speak louder than his own heart, proving that cowardice can wear a handsome face. Through these men, the story teaches us a hard truth. Not everyone who rejects us is proving we are unworthy. Sometimes, they are only proving they were never strong enough to stand beside us. Wyatt Sterling is not perfect when Clara first arrives. He is practical, guarded, and afraid. He offers her work, space, and a choice, but he also hides the truth about why he needs a wife. That betrayal matters because real respect cannot grow from half-truths. Clara's anger is righteous. She understands that agency is not real if the rules of the game are hidden. In that moment, she teaches Wyatt, and us, that dignity is not only about being treated kindly. It is about being trusted with the truth. To love someone, or even to build a life with them, means giving them the full knowledge they need to choose freely. Yet Wyatt's journey is also one of healing. He is a man terrified of becoming the father who hurt him. He believes distance is safety, and a business arrangement is easier than love, because love requires vulnerability. But Clara sees what he cannot see in himself. A monster does not fear becoming cruel. A monster excuses cruelty. Wyatt's fear is proof that his conscience is still alive. The story reminds us that we are not condemned to repeat the sins of those who raised us. Blood may carry history, but character is built through choices. Wyatt chooses restraint. He chooses honesty. He chooses to fix the mud instead of blaming Clara for falling. He chooses to build a ramp instead of trying to change her body. In those quiet acts, he becomes the kind of man his father never was. One of the deepest lessons of this story is about the difference between fixing a person and honoring a person. Dr. Mercer offers Clara surgery, and perhaps in another life, that surgery might have been a gift. But the question is not whether Clara can be made to walk straighter. The question is whose voice she is listening to when she decides. For years, she has seen herself through the eyes of pitying neighbors, disappointed suitors, and a society that treats difference as defect. When Wyatt tells her she does not owe the world a perfect stride, he gives her back the most sacred form of freedom, the right to decide what her own body means. Clara's refusal of the surgery is not a rejection of healing. It is a declaration that she is already whole. Amos and Maeve give Clara the kind of community she never had in Clover Creek. Amos understands the language of pain because he carries his own limp from war. Maeve understands what it means to be judged by an accent, a history, and a prejudice that has nothing to do with the quality of her heart. Together, they help Clara see that society often wants people fixed, not for the comfort of the wounded, but for the comfort of those who do not want to be reminded that life is fragile and imperfect. Their presence teaches us that healing often begins when we are surrounded by people who do not ask us to shrink. They make room for us exactly as we are.